Awesome. Thank you, Jen. Thank you for all being here. I'm not wearing a suit. This is new for a while.
No tie.
None of us. Really, one important thing. How many people know today is David Yeve's birthday? So I think it's only appropriate we sing happy birthday to David Yeve. So, happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. David Hughes, you should jump out here now. Happy birthday, dear David. Happy birthday to you. Hey! All right, so what we want to do here, there is an incredible amount of awesomeness and wisdom that is here, and we're going to jump all around and try to cover as much turf and territory as we possibly can. So with Lynn and Beth, one of the things that's there is you guys have been involved in everything from the incredible nitty-gritty details all the way to looking across the entire nation and spanning the scope of the entire so-called stack of government. And so maybe starting with you, Beth, you know, one of the things I don't think people know about you is you actually started off your career as a probation officer, which is a story I hope other people ask, like, how do you go from being a probation officer to being an executive director? But maybe could you talk to us a little bit about what is the lesson learned of being in the nuances of interacting with a person at that very detailed level of a probation officer that you have taken away as you've moved up and down the stack and now sitting at this looking across the nation?
I think the most important thing, and thanks for having me, I'm very happy to be here. The most important thing that I learned working at the front line for nearly half a decade was that government attracts some of the brightest and smartest people that really are invested in good outcomes for people. And I think we continuously undervalue the fact that really good people, really smart people work in government. And the bureaucracy does that to frontline workers, and I think also the public perception does. And so one of the lessons that I've taken in every sort of jump that I've made in my career has been to continuously make sure that that sort of really sort of raw optimism and talent that I observed on the front line, that perspective is brought through across all the work that we do.
Can you give us an example of a place where people didn't expect you to have this perspective? And then people were like, whoa, how did you know that?
Well, I think, you know, for many years I ran state stat, which was sort of how we oversaw the state of Maryland. And I think that people approach the stat process as this sort of I gotcha, and this is the governor's office trying to hold us all accountable. And when I actually got into the room with practitioners and I was able to expose myself as also a practitioner, and I could relate sort of the pain points that they were feeling, all of a sudden you saw much better buy-in, you saw a different level of collaboration, and you realized that you had an advocate in the room instead of this like, and that really is just like freeing up space so people can take risks, can think differently about problems, and we're not deliberate about that enough in the ways that we make decisions in government, and I think that that's happened sort of across my career, and then also as I've developed people in government to sort of replicate that same sort of set of skills.
Interesting. Lynn, you started off as a public defender.
I did.
Worked on all sorts of different issues all the way up to leading the Data-Driven Justice Initiative for the White House, working with Cecilia. How about for you? What's that thing that you've taken from being there, you know, literally sitting across the table with somebody who's in a very hard situation and you're defending them?
Yeah, so I think Beth and I had really similar experiences, and I think there's something really important for all of us in the room and who work on these issues, which is that if we really care about how government delivers services, they deliver them in local communities. And so I think that we really have not paid enough attention to frontline service delivery, and those are really the hardest and kind of stickiest places to solve these problems, because every single day police officers are making decisions teachers are making decisions. They're making policy decisions. They're implementing policy every day on the ground. We're not giving them the tools that they need to actually make the right decisions. And it's not often because they don't want to make the right decisions. It's because they don't have the information that they need. And so I think bringing that perspective that if you really want to change government delivery, you have to work with these frontline workers, and we have to figure out what are the tools that they're lacking. And I know I have a high degree of confidence if you give them the information that they need, they're going to make dramatically better and different decisions. And it's a little bit shocking. It's funny sometimes when we talk, especially when we were at the White House, when we would talk to people in the private sector, how bad government data actually is, particularly at the local level. And I'm just going to share a slide here, if I can get, speaking of technology. Or maybe not.
Yeah, there it is.
There it is.
It's up on the, yep.
Great. So this is an actual case study from a young woman in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Some of you might be familiar with this format. This is Excel. And so honestly...
At least it's not PDF.
I'm sure it was
low tech,
released as a PDF.
You know, we have this kind of unofficial motto at DDJ, which is data by any means necessary. And to me, the most important thing is we actually need to look at the data. And a couple of things really jump out here. One, if you look at the police and the EMT data separately, you're going to get a very different viewpoint of what this young woman's challenges might be. And in the vast majority of jurisdictions that we work with, the police and EMT don't even get this level of information when they respond. So unless they happen to know that address or they happen to know that individual, they're not going to know that she's had multiple encounters with law enforcement or with emergency medical services. And I think the other thing is when you combine this data, you can see this is a woman who's on a very bad path. And if we don't do something differently for her, she may not end up in a very good place. But the other thing that gives me hope, actually, in looking at this is, look at all of the times the government has encountered this individual. And if we can give these frontline responders better information, they will know that they need to do something differently with her. And so while we would love integrated data systems, we would love beautiful digital tools, we would love digital services, what we actually need is we need information in the hands of the people at the moment that they're making critical decisions so that we can change the trajectory of young women like this. So I think understanding what the possibility of data is, but then also understanding what the realities are on the ground are really the ultimate way that we can solve some of these problems. So
one of the things I'm hearing from both of you is the context that's the context is part of one of the secret elements of the DNA that helps make you effective as you kind of move through these different layers.
Or the design. So, as a probation officer, I would have to make hard decisions in the lives of children and families, and all I had was a police report. I didn't know if the child had been in school. I didn't know if they had access to food. I didn't know, there are lots of contextualizing regressions that could really change the way that the data manifests, right? And if we're not thinking about the way that we're designing service delivery for the best outcome for that child and that family, then we're going to end up with a lot of data that looks a lot like this, where there's uncoordinated services that work at odds with each other. And so, a lot of the work that we do is around how do we redesign government so it's more responsive to need and actually has a focus on outcome instead of sort of these.
Mm-hmm. So you've got a lot of people out here and listening live who are people who also come from very disparate backgrounds, some of which they don't have this context of what it's like to be a probation officer, be a public defender. I remember, being on the data side of things, Lynn introduced me to my first jail, and I had never been to a jail before, so I didn't have the context. What's the advice for people that are out there to gain context so they can be more effective? And what do you see that, as you look across the national landscape, that people do particularly well to make sure the teams have context?
I think it's interesting. One thing is really pick the problem that you want to work on and then figure out who is actually currently doing it in government. And so there are a lot of different agencies where you can go on ride-alongs, you can go visit the jail, whatever that might be. But talking to the people, talking to the public defenders or talking to the probation officers, talk to the people who are in the systems. And I think this is something that's come up over and over again with the speakers, and Cecilia talks about it as well. Really, if we're trying to figure out who are the people that we're trying to serve and who are currently serving them, mapping that out, understanding what their pain points are, understanding what are the tools they need, because sometimes the tools that they need may not actually be technology. Sometimes it might be simple coordination. Sometimes it might be learning what another community did so you can shortcut that moment from I understand that I have a problem to I understand what I can do to solve this problem. There's no shortage of need for help. I think the problem and really where people can dig in is actually defining what are the specific supports or the specific tools that you can provide. So it's not coming in and saying, I'm going to solve this problem, but it's how can I help you solve the problem that you know that you have.
How about you, Beth?
I mean, I think that the role of product manager, which is so strongly valued in the private sector and in software development and in technical development, is completely absent in government. And what we end up then happening is people who are very strong on the program side and then incredibly, fluent IT or technical folks, but we don't have that translator that sits in the middle. Like when I worked in a software company, I was never allowed to talk to engineers. I had to talk to a product manager who understood what my challenges were, and then they would interpret that into a tech, spec. And because that role isn't there, we end up with massive systems for small problems, and we end up with really underutilized systems for really important entrenched problems, and it's a mismatch. And I think that role, that sort of translator role, is one that we need to cultivate and we need to sort of nourish in government and really need to support our public sector partners that are trying to really understand how to scope problems effectively, how to really design programs effectively, and to do that using very strong foundational data practices.
So you've got this inside out, where in some portions of this you've been on the outside, some portions of this both of you have been on the inside. How do you bridge that? How do you make that come together? Like that program manager, that product manager, that idea, getting people in the room to talk about this. What's your secret hack that if, as you've looked across this from Bloomberg, you're looking at this across Arnold, what's that hack that you go, oh, this is how you actually make it happen?
Well, I mean, my hack right now is Bloomberg.
Show me the money.
I mean, the thing is that, look, I mean, the What Works Cities initiative has been incredibly powerful because it absorbs a lot of risk. And it says, we're going to invest in this practice with you as partners. We're going to create a structure for validating, right? So we're going to certify your practices so you have some cover. And then we're going to give you some space to fail. And I think that we've heard this morning about how important it is to understand failure, but also how important it is to provide some of that insurance so that, historically, and look, I come from a very accountability-driven government, and where people did get in trouble and get fired. But we're seeing a shift now where we have to open up space in government for people to be able to take risks, and we need to cultivate talent from across the board. And then we need to really we need to learn from failure, and then we need to quickly learn from success and then help scale that. And initiatives like What Works Cities that, and all the work that Arnold is doing, that really is a mechanism that has been our hack, which has been like, we can absorb it for you, just trust us and let us help you. And then also, let's heavily invest in the skills of the public sector.
Lynn?
Yeah, it's actually interesting. Beth and I have been talking a lot about the similarities between our two organizations. We both have very strong founder-led organizations. So it's a real pleasure to work with Laura and John Arnold. They're very involved in all of our decision making, and they're really willing to take risk. I think that's another commonality. Also that we tend to we see government as our partner, largely because I think what we've seen is that a ton of innovation happens in local governments. I also don't want to lose the differentiation between local, state, and federal. Worked in feds, worked locally. What I've observed is that a ton of innovation happens at the local level because as you're on the ground doing the service delivery, that's where you figure out who's doing where are the problems and who's hacking around it. So a lot of the work that we do at the Arnold Foundation is to support local governments and actually making those hacks easier, making those hacks replicable, and figuring out, does this hack in fact work? Are we making these systems better? And I think philanthropy has a huge role to play in helping innovate. And I think the federal government, and to a certain extent the state government, really their role is scale. Right? I don't know how much we want the federal government to innovate when the outcome, the risk of a bad outcome is so high. So I think a lot of what our foundations do is we provide the space, we provide the support, the resources to do the innovation. We track it, If it doesn't work, we don't scale it. But if it does work, really we have to, I think the next real step for all of us is to figure out how to take these local innovations and flip them back into federal policy, including funding.
And you and Arnold Foundation has a new one that you just announced, attempt of a new model to do this around gun violence.
Yes, so I'm very excited. Just today we announced.
Just in 10 seconds, because we got to switch to another topic.
The Laura and John Arnold Foundation has committed $20 million in funding to a new national collaborative on gun violence research. So we've seen, yes. Obviously, we've seen that there's just been a huge lack of research on the federal side, and we know that gap needs to be filled so that we understand what next steps are. We're seeking to raise another $30 million to get to at least $50 million, but this is a long-term significant commitment for the foundation. We're really excited to start to dig in so that we can come up with practical, common sense solutions.
People should come find you to talk more about this.
Yes.
Right? So I wanted, because we only got like a minute 30 left, so I want to get both your advice on another complete different angle of this. So many of us are working with data and technologies. How do we make sure that as people who are trying to unleash data from the government, we don't have our version of a Cambridge Analytica moment where we open up a whole bunch of data and people get hurt because there's domestic violence victims data, or the data gets stolen. We've heard about weaponization of data. We've heard about automating inequality in those books. What's the advice of how do we make sure we don't actually do something that's harmful?
Well, we invest in governance. I think we don't talk about it enough, but local government needs to invest in governance. There needs to be centralized data policy. It's not sexy. It's not the things that mayors necessarily want to talk about, but it's probably one of the best ways to ensure that you have smart data policies and that you're not recycling bad data in policy, recycling bad data in budgets, and thinking about data differently. If you build a program around the way that data is used and you really value it as a core asset, it can provide massive dividends to you as an executive, but also it can ensure that you don't end up like a Cambridge Analytica situation.
Lynn?
Yep, I also think it's really important to have very clearly defined use cases, to take a deep dive into the data that you're planning to use and really defining what those risks might be. So for example, in our data-driven justice initiative, we use police data, but we use police data as a proxy for service need. So in our calculation, if you're having a high number of encounters with law enforcement on low-level offenses, that actually means that you need to be in a different system. So we're not using it as a proxy for criminality. We need to start thinking about data is flawed. It's just not, it's not possible to get past the fact that there's bias in our data. And I think if you can define what the bias is, you can be as thoughtful as you can be about mitigating that bias. I frankly think there should be algorithmic transparency, or at least around process. Any government algorithm that has any significant impact on a human being's life, the public should be able to know about that. They should be able to give feedback on how that's used. And then we should be auditing. We should be looking at the outcomes. So no matter how thoughtful you are about mitigating risk, no matter how transparent and thoughtful you are about your algorithm, you should continually check, is this actually achieving the outcomes that I want? And if there's bias in my outcomes, then you need to start all over again.
Fantastic. And I will just add on top of that, at least from my perspective, I think every data scientist should consider taking an oath, as well as every data scientist or technologist that's out there must be trained when they're taking a course on data or technology, database design, all the way to statistics, should all be trained in ethics and security. So for those, absolutely. Right? So we're out of time, but if you want to continue interacting with you, what's the best way for people to connect with you and talk to you?
Certainly grab me if you're here in person. Tweet at me.
Lynn Overmann, at Lynn Overmann.
At Lynn Overmann, yep.
L-Y-N-O-V-E-R-M-A-N-N.
Yep. And then we'll move over to old school email from there.
Yeah. I'll be here also, so feel free. And then at BI Blauer or at GovX on Twitter.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you for all being here and supporting on the mission. Thank you.
Thanks.